Let us begin our journey tonight by drifting back in time, not to a story of ancient myths or distant stars, but to a time well within living memory, a time of profound darkness and immense, quiet courage. This is the story of D-Day, the beginning of the end of the Second World War in Europe. But to truly understand the significance of this single, momentous day, we must first understand the world as it was in the early months of 1944. A great and terrible shadow had fallen across the continent of Europe. From the northern fjords of Norway to the sun-drenched shores of Greece, the vast majority of the continent was now under the firm and often brutal control of Nazi Germany. For years, the people of occupied Europe had lived under this shadow, a daily reality of fear, of scarcity, and of a quiet, desperate hope for liberation. Can you picture it? Imagine the great, historic cities of Europe, Paris, Amsterdam, Brussels, their streets now echoing with the sound of marching boots and the rumble of military vehicles. The vibrant life of these cities had been replaced by a tense and somber quiet. On the other side of the English Channel, the island nation of Great Britain stood as the last great bastion of freedom in Western Europe, a fortress island that had endured the terrible Blitz and now served as the staging ground for the great liberation to come. And it was here, in the quiet, unassuming offices of the Allied High Command, that a group of men faced a task of almost unimaginable scale and consequence. They were planning the largest and most complex amphibious invasion in all of human history, an operation that would be known to the world as Operation Overlord. The fate of the entire free world rested on their shoulders. What was the great obstacle they faced? It was the Atlantic Wall. This was not a single, continuous wall, but a vast and intricate network of coastal defenses that the Germans had constructed all along the western coast of Europe, stretching for thousands of miles from Norway all the way down to the border of Spain. It was a formidable and terrifying series of concrete bunkers, of massive artillery emplacements, of tank traps, and of millions upon millions of hidden mines, all designed with a single purpose: to repel any Allied attempt to land on the continent. The German High Command, particularly the brilliant and respected Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been tasked with overseeing its defenses, was confident that this great wall was impenetrable, that it would throw any invading army back into the sea in a storm of fire and steel. It was against this seemingly unbreakable wall that the Allied planners, led by the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had to devise their strategy. The pressure on these men was immense. They knew that a frontal assault on the most heavily defended part of the coast, the Pas-de-Calais, which was the shortest and most logical route across the Channel, would almost certainly result in a catastrophic failure. They had learned a hard and bloody lesson from the disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942, where a similar frontal assault had been completely and utterly annihilated. So they had to find another way. They had to choose a different location, a less obvious one, and they had to do so in the utmost secrecy. The coast of Normandy was eventually chosen for its wide, sandy beaches and its relative proximity to the ports of southern England. But this choice came with its own immense set of challenges. The planning for Operation Overlord was a masterpiece of logistics, of strategy, and of deception. It involved the coordination of millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and the movement of thousands of ships and aircraft. Every detail had to be meticulously planned, from the timing of the tides and the phases of the moon to the exact amount of supplies that each individual soldier would need to carry ashore. And all of this had to be done under a complete and total veil of secrecy. The success of the entire operation depended on achieving one thing above all else: surprise. The Germans knew that an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where, or when. And so, as the spring of 1944 turned into summer, a great and powerful sense of anticipation began to build on both sides of the English Channel. In the occupied lands, people listened to their secret radios, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and fear. And in the great staging areas of southern England, millions of young men from America, from Britain, from Canada, and from all across the Allied world, made their final preparations, their faces a quiet mask of determination as they waited for the signal that would launch the great crusade to liberate a continent. The shadow over Europe was deep, but a new dawn was about to break. The ultimate success of the entire D-Day invasion, the greatest and most complex amphibious landing in all of human history, hinged on one critical and incredibly fragile element: surprise. The Allied planners, the great minds who were gathered at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, knew, with a chilling certainty, that if the German High Command could accurately predict the time and, more importantly, the precise location of the main invasion, their powerful reserves, particularly their elite and fearsome panzer tank divisions, could be rushed to the coast to drive the Allied forces back into the sea before they could ever establish a secure foothold. To prevent this absolutely catastrophic outcome, they devised one of the most complex, most audacious, and most stunningly successful strategic deception plans in the entire history of warfare. This grand and multifaceted plan was given the codename Operation Bodyguard. Its sole and all-encompassing purpose was to mislead the German High Command, to create a great phantom, a ghost army, and to convince them, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the main Allied invasion would strike not at the shores of Normandy, but at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest and most logical point of the English Channel. Operation Bodyguard was not a single, simple plan, but a vast and intricate web of interlocking deceptions, a great symphony of lies that was being conducted on a global scale. At its very heart was a massive and incredibly detailed sub-operation known as Operation Fortitude. This was the brilliant plan to create the complete and convincing illusion of a massive, fictitious army group, the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, which was supposedly being assembled in the southeast of England, directly opposite the Pas-de-Calais. Can you picture it? To give this great ghost army a sense of tangible reality, the Allies engaged in a remarkable and almost theatrical production on a massive scale. In the quiet fields and towns of Kent, a team of artists, engineers, and soldiers from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit often referred to as the Ghost Army, constructed a vast and convincing illusion. They built hundreds of inflatable, dummy tanks that looked real from the air, they created entire airfields filled with plywood aircraft, and they assembled great fleets of fake landing craft in the harbors, all designed to be seen and photographed by the German reconnaissance planes that flew high overhead. They even employed special sound trucks to broadcast the noises of a massive army on the move, the rumble of tank engines, the shouts of soldiers on maneuvers, the sound of construction, all to create a completely convincing soundscape of a great military force preparing for a massive invasion. But a great army, even a phantom one, needs a great and famous commander. And to lead their ghost army, the Allies chose one of their most brilliant and, at the same time, most controversial and famous generals, George S. Patton. Patton, who was being disciplined at the time for a slapping incident in Sicily, was the very general that the Germans feared the most. They saw him as the Allies' most aggressive and successful battlefield commander. And so, the Allies, in a stroke of psychological genius, deliberately placed him in command of their fictional army, knowing that the German intelligence services would be watching his every move. They sent him on a series of very high-profile and very public inspection tours throughout southeastern England, further reinforcing the German belief that their greatest adversary was preparing to lead the main invasion force at the Pas-de-Calais. But the great deception went even deeper than this, into the shadowy and dangerous world of espionage and double agents. The British intelligence services, MI5 and MI6, had, through a brilliant and long-running effort, successfully managed to capture or to turn almost every single German spy who was operating in Britain. They now used this incredible network of double agents to feed a steady and continuous stream of false and misleading information directly to the German High Command. The most important and most successful of all of these double agents was a man named Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish citizen whose German code name was the now famous Garbo. He was an agent so trusted and so valued by the Germans that they had awarded him their highest decoration, the Iron Cross, for his supposed services to the Third Reich. But in reality, Garbo was working for the British, and he, along with his own completely fictitious network of 27 imaginary sub-agents, skillfully and artistically painted a detailed and utterly convincing, but completely false, picture of the Allied invasion plans, a picture that pointed directly and unequivocally to the Pas-de-Calais as the main target. At the same time, the Allies conducted a sophisticated and complex campaign of electronic deception. They used their radio networks to transmit a vast amount of fake radio traffic, all seemingly originating from the various command posts of the Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group in Kent. This fake traffic was designed to mimic the patterns of a real army preparing for an invasion, creating the illusion of a massive force on the move. They also conducted a series of real, but limited, bombing raids and naval demonstrations along the coast of the Pas-de-Calais, all designed to keep the German attention firmly and completely fixed on the wrong location. And this great and intricate deception was a stunning and almost unbelievable success. The German High Command, including Adolf Hitler himself, completely and totally bought the lie. They became utterly convinced that the main Allied invasion would indeed come at the Pas-de-Calais. And as a result, they kept their most powerful and most elite divisions, particularly the formidable 15th Army and its powerful panzer tank divisions, stationed there, waiting for an invasion that would never come. And so, as the real invasion force, the largest fleet ever assembled in human history, began to secretly gather in the ports of southern England, preparing to strike at the shores of Normandy, their greatest weapon was not their tanks or their battleships. It was the great, intricate, and powerful web of deception that had been so carefully and so brilliantly woven by the Allied planners. The Great Deception had set the stage for the Great Invasion. In the first few days of the month of June, 1944, a profound and heavy quiet, a sense of immense, coiled energy, had fallen over the entire southern coast of England. From the great, bustling ports of Portsmouth and Southampton to the smallest, most secluded harbors and fishing villages, the largest and most powerful invasion fleet in all of human history had been secretly and meticulously assembled. It was a sight that defied the imagination. Over 5,000 ships, great, gray, silent battleships, their long guns pointing towards a distant shore, nimble destroyers, built for speed and aggression, and thousands upon thousands of flat-bottomed landing craft, all lay at anchor, their decks crowded with the intricate and deadly machinery of modern war and with the young men who would soon be asked to wield it. The ancient fields and the green forests of southern England had been transformed into vast, sprawling military camps, a temporary home to over 2 million Allied soldiers. These were men from all across the free world, from the Great Plains of America, from the industrial cities of Britain, from the vast, open spaces of Canada, and from all the other Allied nations who had sent their sons to fight for the liberation of a continent. They were all part of a great and unified force, and they now waited, with a mixture of quiet, steely determination and a deep, gnawing anxiety, for the signal that would launch the Great Crusade. But as the planned invasion date of June 5 drew near, a new and completely unpredictable enemy began to emerge, an enemy that no army could conquer, that no general could outwit, the notoriously treacherous and violent weather of the English Channel. A great and powerful storm had swept in from the vast Atlantic, churning the gray seas into a violent, chaotic maelstrom and whipping the skies into a fury of wind and rain. The conditions were far too dangerous for any amphibious landing. The waves, cresting at over 6 feet, were too high for the small, vulnerable landing craft, and the thick, low, impenetrable cloud cover would make it impossible for the thousands of Allied aircraft to provide the crucial, overwhelming air support that the ground troops would need to survive their first, desperate hours on the beaches. The entire, massive operation, an undertaking that had been years in the planning, now hung precariously in the balance, a hostage to the whims of the wind and the waves. At the Allied Supreme Headquarters, a converted school building near Portsmouth, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man upon whose shoulders the entire fate of the free world now rested, faced the most difficult and agonizing decision of his entire life. He gathered his top commanders and his chief meteorologist, a brilliant but beleaguered man named Group Captain James Stagg, in a small, smoke-filled room. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of stale cigars. Can you imagine the immense, crushing weight of that moment? Postponing the invasion would be incredibly risky. It would mean keeping millions of men and thousands of ships in a state of high alert, a secret of such magnitude that it would become harder and harder to keep with each passing hour. The men, their spirits wound tight for the great battle, would begin to lose their edge. And the next available date with the right combination of a low tide and a full moon was weeks away, in a different and less favorable weather window. But to launch the invasion in such terrible weather, to go ahead as planned, would be to send his men to their certain deaths, to risk the entire operation, and perhaps the entire war, in a desperate gamble against the storm. Group Captain Stagg, his face etched with the strain of his immense responsibility, presented Eisenhower with a sliver of hope, a small and fragile window of opportunity. He predicted, with as much certainty as a man can have when predicting the future, that there would be a brief break in the storm on the morning of June 6, a temporary lull that might just be long enough for the invasion to proceed. It was a huge gamble, a decision that would have to be based not on certainty, but on a forecast. After hours of tense and difficult deliberation, after listening to the counsel of all his commanders, Eisenhower finally made his decision. In the quiet, early hours of the morning of June 5, he looked at the exhausted and anxious men gathered around him and said, simply, "Okay, let's go." With those three small, quiet words, the Great Crusade was launched. As the news of the decision spread like wildfire through the vast invasion force, a new and different kind of energy began to fill the air. The long and tedious period of waiting was finally over. Now, in the final, precious hours before the launch, the soldiers, the sailors, and the airmen made their final, personal preparations. What do you think a young man does on the eve of the greatest battle in history? Many of them wrote letters home, their pens scratching quietly on the thin, airmail paper, trying to find the words to express their love, their hopes, and their fears. They wrote to their mothers, to their sweethearts, and to their fathers, letters that they knew, in the quiet depths of their hearts, might be the very last they would ever write. Others found solace in quiet prayer, their heads bowed in the dim, red light of the transport ships. And many engaged in a kind of gallows humor, sharing quiet jokes and stories, a simple and profoundly human attempt to push back against the immense and overwhelming fear of the great unknown that lay ahead of them. They checked their equipment one last time, their hands moving with a practiced and deliberate care. They cleaned their rifles, they packed their ammunition, and they looked at the worn, creased photographs of the loved ones they had left behind, their faces a quiet mask of determination. And then, as the night of June 5 deepened, the first great engines began to roar to life. The paratroopers of the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, and the British 6th Airborne Division, their faces now darkened with camouflage paint, began to board their C-47 transport planes. These were the men who would be the very tip of the spear, the ones who would drop into the darkness behind the enemy lines hours before the main beach landings. As they flew out over the stormy, white-capped waters of the English Channel, into the heart of the night, they were flying towards a destiny that was completely unknown. They were the vanguard of the Great Liberation, the first of the many thousands of men who were about to embark on the longest and most difficult day of their lives. The Great Invasion had begun. In the final, dark hours of June 5, 1944, as the massive Allied invasion fleet was beginning its perilous journey across the stormy English Channel, the first wave of the Great Assault was already taking to the skies. This was the vanguard of Operation Overlord, the elite paratroopers of the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, and the British 6th Airborne Division. Their mission was a truly daring and incredibly dangerous one: to drop into the darkness behind the enemy lines hours before the main beach landings, to sow chaos and confusion among the German defenders, and to secure the vital bridges and causeways that would be essential for the Allied forces to break out from the beaches. The success or failure of the entire D-Day invasion would rest heavily on the shoulders of these brave men, who were about to leap into the unknown, into the heart of Fortress Europe. Can you picture the scene? Imagine the inside of a C-47 transport plane, a cramped and rattling metal tube filled with young men. The air is thick with the smell of engine fuel, of canvas, and of nervous sweat. The soldiers are weighed down by an immense amount of equipment: their parachutes, their heavy rifles, their ammunition, their grenades, and all the other tools of war they would need to survive and to fight alone in hostile territory. The planes drone on through the turbulent night sky, buffeted by the same powerful storm that had so nearly cancelled the entire operation. Inside, the men sit in a heavy silence, each one lost in his own private thoughts, their young faces dimly illuminated by the faint, red glow of the cabin lights. Some may have been thinking of their families back home, of the letters they had just written, letters filled with a brave and casual cheerfulness that belied the fear in their hearts. Others may have been quietly praying, their hands gripping the rosaries or the small Bibles they carried with them, finding a final moment of peace before the chaos. It was a moment of profound and quiet solitude, the final calm before the great storm of battle that awaited them on the ground below. As the great fleet of transport planes crossed over the coast of Normandy, the night sky erupted with the terrifying and beautiful spectacle of anti-aircraft fire. The German defenders on the ground, now alerted to their presence, began to fill the sky with a deadly web of tracer rounds and explosive flak shells. The pilots of the C-47s, flying low and fast to avoid the enemy fire, were often forced to take violent, evasive action, which caused the carefully planned parachute drops to become scattered and dangerously disorganized. The green light flashed inside the planes, the signal to jump. And one by one, the paratroopers shuffled to the open door and leaped out into the chaotic night, into a sky filled with fire and a wind that tore at them. Many of the paratroopers, instead of landing in their designated, open drop zones, found themselves scattered all across the Norman countryside, often alone or in small, isolated groups. The initial hours of the airborne invasion were a scene of immense chaos and profound confusion. Men who had trained for months to fight alongside their comrades now found themselves completely alone, in the dark, in the middle of enemy territory, with no idea where they were or where their units had landed. They landed in flooded fields, in dense forests, and even in the middle of German-occupied villages. But these were elite soldiers, some of the best trained and most resourceful men in the entire Allied army. And in the face of this chaos, they demonstrated an incredible resilience and an unwavering determination. What did they have to find each other in the dark? A small, simple child's toy, a metal clicker that made the sound of a cricket. One click was the challenge. 2 clicks was the response. Imagine the tension of that sound in the darkness, the click that could bring either a friend or a foe. And with these simple clickers, these scattered groups of paratroopers began to find one another. They formed small, ad hoc units, often led by the highest-ranking officer present, regardless of his unit, and with a courage that is almost difficult to comprehend, they began to carry out their missions. They attacked German patrols, they sabotaged vital communication lines, and they began to secure the crucial crossroads and bridges that were their primary objectives. The British 6th Airborne Division, in a particularly brilliant and daring operation, successfully captured the crucial Pegasus Bridge over the Orne Canal. How did they achieve this? They came not by parachute, but in great, silent gliders that landed just yards from the bridge in the dead of night, achieving complete and total surprise. This key victory would prevent German armored reinforcements from reaching the landing beaches. The airborne invasion, while incredibly chaotic and costly, was a remarkable success. The paratroopers had succeeded in sowing confusion and disruption deep within the enemy's rear, diverting German attention and precious resources away from the coast just as the main invasion fleet was approaching. Their incredible bravery and their profound sacrifice in the dark hours of that night had paved the way for the great amphibious landing that was about to begin. As the first faint light of dawn began to break on the eastern horizon, the paratroopers on the ground, many of them still fighting for their lives in small, isolated pockets, could hear a new and powerful sound, a deep and thunderous rumble that was coming from the sea. It was the sound of the great Allied naval bombardment that was heralding the arrival of the main invasion force. The longest day had truly begun. While the brave paratroopers were fighting their desperate and scattered battles in the darkness of the Norman countryside, a far larger and more powerful force was making its way across the treacherous, dark waters of the English Channel. This was the great Allied invasion fleet, the largest armada ever assembled in all of human history, a vast and silent city of ships moving through the stormy night towards a violent and uncertain dawn. Over 5,000 vessels, a number so large it is difficult to truly comprehend, pushed their way through the choppy seas. Great, gray, silent battleships, their long guns pointing towards a distant shore they could not yet see, nimble destroyers, built for speed and aggression, acting as shepherds for the great flock, and thousands upon thousands of small, flat-bottomed, and incredibly vulnerable landing craft, all pitched and rolled in the unforgiving waves. The very air was thick with the low, deep, and constant murmur of thousands of engines, a sound that seemed to make the very ocean vibrate. It was thick with the smell of sea salt and diesel fuel, and with the quiet, nervous, and electric energy of over 150,000 young men who were about to embark on the most dangerous and most important journey of their lives. Can you picture the scene inside one of those landing craft? In the cramped, cold, steel bellies of these vessels, men were packed together, shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale and grim in the dim, red light that was used to preserve their night vision. The rough seas of the Channel, still churning from the great storm, made the journey a miserable and agonizing one. Many of the soldiers, who were not natural sailors, were terribly seasick, their courage tested not yet by enemy fire, but by the relentless, heaving motion of the waves. What do you think they were thinking, in those long, dark hours? They listened to the constant, groaning creak of the hull, to the slap of the cold, dark water against the steel ramp that was the only thing separating them from the sea, and from the great unknown that lay ahead. Some men, perhaps, tried to find a corner to sleep, a brief and fitful respite from the tension. Others checked their equipment over and over again, their hands moving with a practiced and deliberate care, a small ritual to keep the fear at bay. They cleaned their rifles, they packed their ammunition, and they looked at the worn, creased photographs of the loved ones they had left behind, their faces a quiet mask of determination. As the great fleet approached the still dark coast of Normandy, in the final hour before the sun began to rise, a new and terrible dawn broke upon the eastern horizon. It was a man-made sunrise, a sunrise of fire and of steel. This was the great pre-landing naval bombardment. Thousands upon thousands of guns from the Allied battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire, unleashing a deafening and relentless barrage upon the German coastal defenses. The entire coastline erupted in a series of massive, rolling explosions, as tons upon tons of high-explosive shells rained down upon the concrete bunkers and the great artillery emplacements of the Atlantic Wall. At the same time, thousands of Allied bombers appeared in the sky above, their engines a deep and powerful drone, adding their own devastating payload to the great symphony of destruction. This immense bombardment was designed to shatter the German defenses, to clear the beaches of their deadly obstacles, and to stun the defenders in their bunkers, paving the way for the infantry who were to follow. And now, the final and most perilous part of the journey began. The small landing craft, having weathered the long crossing, began to make their final approach to the shore, to the 5 designated landing beaches that were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each of these beaches, stretching across a 50-mile front of the Normandy coast, presented its own unique set of challenges, and each one would soon become the stage for its own unique story of incredible courage and profound sacrifice. The American forces were assigned to the westernmost beaches, Utah and Omaha. The British forces were assigned to Gold and Sword. And the Canadian forces were tasked with taking the beach codenamed Juno. As the landing craft scraped against the sandy shores of Normandy, their flat bottoms grinding on the unseen sandbars, and as the great steel ramps began to lower with a deafening, grinding sound, the men inside took a final, deep, collective breath. They had reached the shores of France. The longest day had truly and finally begun. What awaited them on the other side of that ramp was the great unknown, a stretch of sand and sea that would, in the next few hours, become one of the most famous and most costly battlefields in all of human history. Of the 5 great Allied landing beaches of D-Day, one name would become forever synonymous with immense suffering, profound sacrifice, and the incredible, desperate courage of the common soldier. This was Omaha Beach. For the American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, many of whom were experiencing combat for the very first time, the longest day would prove to be a true and terrifying descent into hell. What was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated amphibious assault quickly devolved into a chaotic and brutal struggle for survival against a determined and well-prepared enemy. The story of Omaha Beach is a powerful and humbling reminder of the true cost of war and the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. What went so terribly wrong at Omaha? It was, in truth, a perfect storm of disastrous circumstances, a series of fateful events that conspired to turn the landing into a near catastrophe. First, the crucial pre-landing naval and aerial bombardment, which was meant to shatter the German defenses, had been largely ineffective. The bombers, flying in thick cloud cover, had delayed their release and their bombs had fallen harmlessly several miles inland, leaving the German fortifications on the beach completely untouched. The naval bombardment, while intense, also failed to destroy the most well-protected German gun emplacements, which were nestled in concrete casemates and dug deep into the high bluffs that overlooked the beach. Second, the Allied intelligence had dangerously underestimated the strength of the German defenders in this sector. They had expected to face a single regiment of lower-quality troops. But in a stroke of terrible luck for the Americans, the experienced and battle-hardened German 352nd Infantry Division had recently been moved into the area to conduct anti-invasion exercises. These were not second-rate soldiers, they were well-trained veterans who were now waiting for the Americans from their heavily fortified positions. And finally, the treacherous weather and the rough seas that had so nearly cancelled the entire invasion took their own terrible toll. Many of the landing craft were swamped by the high waves, and the specialized amphibious DD tanks, which were meant to provide crucial fire support for the infantry, were launched too far from shore. Most of these swimming tanks sank almost immediately in the choppy waters, leaving the first waves of infantry with almost no armored support at all. And so, as the ramps of the first landing craft dropped, the American soldiers were met not by a shattered and dazed enemy, but by a storm of incredibly intense and accurate machine gun and artillery fire. The beach itself, a long and open expanse of sand with very few natural obstacles, became a chaotic killing zone. The German machine guns, positioned perfectly in their concrete bunkers on the bluffs above, had created a devastating crossfire that swept across the entire beach. The American soldiers, weighed down by their heavy equipment, struggled through the cold, red-tinged water and across the open sand, with nowhere to hide. Many were hit before they even had a chance to fire their weapons. The initial assault waves were pinned down at the water's edge, their carefully laid plans completely unraveling in the face of this brutal and overwhelming resistance. The casualties were immense, and for a time, it seemed as though the entire landing at Omaha might fail. But in this moment of absolute crisis, when it seemed that all was lost, leadership began to emerge, not just from the top, but from the very bottom. With many of the officers and senior non-commissioned officers among the first to be killed or wounded, junior officers and sergeants began to rally the dazed and terrified survivors around them. A single captain here, a lone sergeant there, began to gather small groups of men, urging them forward, reminding them of their training, and leading by sheer force of will. The famous American general, Norman Cota, famously told his men on the beach, "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach, those who are dead, and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Slowly, painstakingly, and in small, desperate groups, the American soldiers began to push forward. They used the few beach obstacles that had not been cleared by the bombardment as a meager form of cover, inching their way across the deadly expanse of sand. They used Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes filled with explosives, to blow gaps in the barbed wire defenses. And then, they began the slow and agonizing climb up the steep bluffs that overlooked the beach, often under a constant hail of enemy fire. By the end of the long and bloody day, the Americans, through sheer, dogged determination and incredible acts of individual courage, had finally secured a tenuous foothold on bloody Omaha. But the price of this small strip of French coastline had been staggering. The sands of Omaha had been consecrated by the immense courage and the profound sacrifice of the men who fought there, a harrowing but absolutely essential victory in the long and difficult fight to liberate a continent. While the American forces were locked in their desperate and bloody struggle on the unforgiving sands of Omaha, the great Allied invasion was unfolding all along a 50-mile front of the Normandy coast. 4 other great landing beaches, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were telling their own unique stories of courage, of challenge, and ultimately, of hard-won success. Each of these beaches presented its own set of obstacles, and each would become the stage for its own dramatic chapter in the story of the longest day. It was here, on these 4 beaches, that the British, the Canadian, and other American forces would fight to secure the vital footholds that were so essential for the overall success of the entire D-Day operation, their fates intertwined with, yet distinct from, the horror that was unfolding at Omaha. Let us first travel to the westernmost of all the landing beaches, a stretch of coastline codenamed Utah. Here, the American 4th Infantry Division was tasked with a crucial mission, to secure the beach and to push inland to link up with the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, who, as we have learned, were already fighting for their lives in the darkness behind the coastline. The landing at Utah Beach was, in many ways, a story of incredible and almost miraculous good fortune, an error that turned into a blessing. Strong currents in the channel had pushed the entire landing force more than a mile south of their intended target. But what could have been a complete disaster turned out to be a stroke of immense luck. The area where they landed was, by chance, far less heavily defended than their original objective. The pre-landing aerial bombardment here had been far more effective than at Omaha, and many of the German gun emplacements had been silenced. As the ramps of the first landing craft dropped, the soldiers were met with only sporadic and relatively light resistance. The first senior officer to land on the beach was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the former American president. Despite his age, a heart condition, and the fact that he was the only general to land in the first wave on any beach, he had insisted on landing with his men. Wading ashore with his cane in one hand and his pistol in the other, he quickly realized they were in the wrong place. But instead of panicking, he famously declared, with a calm and reassuring confidence, "We'll start the war from right here." His courageous and steady leadership on the beach was absolutely instrumental in rallying the men, in reorganizing the scattered units, and in directing them towards their new objectives. The landing at Utah was a remarkable success, with relatively few casualties, and by the end of the day, the American forces had pushed several miles inland and had successfully linked up with the beleaguered paratroopers, securing the vital western flank of the entire Normandy invasion. Now, let us journey eastward, across the chaotic waters, to the two beaches that were assigned to the British forces, Gold and Sword. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division faced a series of well-fortified German positions that were dotted along the coast. But the British came ashore with a series of secret weapons, a menagerie of ingenious, specially modified armored vehicles that were known collectively as Hobart's Funnies, named after their creator, Major General Percy Hobart. Can you picture them? There were the Sherman Crab tanks, great beasts that had massive, rotating flails on the front, with heavy chains that beat the ground and safely detonated the hidden German mines, clearing a safe path for the infantry. There were the AVRE tanks, which were equipped with massive, short-barreled mortars that could lob huge explosive charges, nicknamed flying dustbins, to destroy thick concrete bunkers with a single, devastating shot. And there were even incredible amphibious DD tanks that had successfully swum ashore, unlike at Omaha, and tanks that could lay down their own bridges to cross wide anti-tank ditches or to scale high sea walls. These remarkable machines proved to be incredibly effective, clearing paths through the German defenses and providing crucial armored support for the infantry. The landing at Gold Beach was a hard-fought but ultimately successful operation, with the British forces managing to push several miles inland by the end of the day. At Sword Beach, the easternmost of all the landing beaches, the British 3rd Infantry Division came ashore with one of the most ambitious objectives of the entire D-Day operation, the capture of the strategic and heavily defended city of Caen. The initial landing at Sword was successful, and the British forces, led by commandos with their famous bagpipes playing, managed to secure the beach and to link up with the British paratroopers who had so heroically captured the vital Pegasus Bridge hours earlier. However, as the British forces tried to push inland towards the great prize of Caen, they were met with increasingly fierce and determined German resistance. They were also the target of the only major German armored counterattack of the day, launched by the formidable 21st Panzer Division. While the British were able to hold off this counterattack with their own tanks and anti-tank guns, the fierce fighting bogged down their advance, and they were unable to capture the crucial city of Caen on the first day. This would lead to a long and bloody battle for the city in the weeks and months to come. And what of the beach that lay between the two British landing zones? This was Juno Beach, and it was assigned to the brave soldiers of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. The Canadians at Juno faced some of the most difficult and treacherous conditions of any of the landing forces. The rough seas had delayed their landing, which meant that the tide was now higher, covering many of the deadly beach obstacles and making the job of the demolition teams incredibly dangerous. As their landing craft approached the shore, they were met with intense and accurate fire from a series of well-placed German bunkers that had survived the initial bombardment. The casualties in the first wave were tragically high, second only to those at Omaha Beach. But despite these terrible initial losses, the Canadian forces fought with an incredible courage and a fierce, unwavering determination. They pushed through the heavy fire, they cleared the beach defenses, and they began to advance inland. And by the end of that long and bloody day, the Canadians at Juno Beach had managed to push further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day, a remarkable and heroic achievement that was a testament to their incredible fighting spirit. By the end of that day, the stories of these 4 beaches, when combined with the terrible sacrifice at Omaha, had come together to create a single, vital achievement. The Allies had breached the Great Atlantic Wall. They were back in France. The Great Crusade for the liberation of Europe had truly and finally begun. In the grand and complex symphony of the D-Day invasion, amidst the great clashes on the main landing beaches, a small and incredibly daring side operation was unfolding, a mission so perilous that it bordered on the suicidal. Between the American beaches of Utah and Omaha, there stood a formidable and sheer cliff known as Point du Hoc. And it was here that one of the most heroic and legendary actions of the entire war would take place. From the top of these 100-foot-high cliffs, a powerful German battery of long-range 155mm cannons was thought to be positioned, great guns that could rain down a devastating and accurate fire on both of the American landing beaches, potentially turning both Utah and Omaha into catastrophic killing zones. The Allied High Command knew that these guns had to be silenced at all costs. The immense and almost impossible task of neutralizing this threat was given to the elite soldiers of the 2nd U.S. Army Ranger Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Rutter. Their mission was simple in its objective, but terrifying in its execution. They were to land at the base of the cliffs, scale them under what was expected to be a hail of intense enemy fire, and destroy the German gun battery at the top. It was a plan that required a unique combination of incredible skill, profound courage, and perhaps, a great deal of luck. As the main invasion force was approaching the Normandy coast, the small flotilla of landing craft carrying the Rangers made its way towards the imposing cliffs of Point du Hoc. The journey was a difficult one. One of the main landing craft carrying troops and supplies was swamped by the rough seas and sank, a tragic loss before the battle had even truly begun. And due to a navigational error, the remaining Rangers were landed slightly east of their intended target, forcing them to spend precious time maneuvering their craft back to the correct position under the growing light of the dawn. As they finally approached the base of the cliffs, the German defenders at the top were now fully alerted to their presence, and they began to unleash a furious and deadly fire down upon the small landing craft. What happened next was a feat of almost superhuman bravery. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, the Rangers, who were under an intense and constant barrage of machine gun fire and grenades being dropped from above, began to fire a series of rocket-propelled grappling hooks up towards the top of the sheer cliffs. These hooks trailed long, wet, and heavy ropes, the Rangers' only lifeline to the top. And then, one by one, they began to climb. Can you imagine it? Young men, weighed down by their heavy combat gear, climbing hand over hand up these slippery ropes, with bullets and grenades raining down all around them. It was a slow, agonizing, and incredibly dangerous ascent. Many Rangers were hit and fell from the ropes, their bodies lost to the churning sea below. But still, they climbed on, their faces a mask of grim determination, their resolve unshaken. After what seemed like an eternity, the first Rangers finally reached the top of the cliffs, pulling themselves over the edge and immediately engaging the German defenders in a fierce and desperate firefight. Slowly, painstakingly, more and more Rangers made it to the top, and they began to fight their way towards the great concrete gun emplacements where the massive cannons were supposed to be. But when they finally reached the casemates, they were met with a shocking and heart-stopping discovery: the guns were gone. The massive artillery pieces, the entire reason for this incredibly costly and dangerous assault, were not there. Had it all been for nothing? Had all the sacrifice been in vain? Colonel Rudder and his men refused to believe it. They quickly regrouped and began to search further inland, following a set of tracks that led away from the empty gun emplacements. And about a mile inland, in a small apple orchard, they found them. The 5 great cannons were there, carefully camouflaged and aimed down the roads that led away from Utah Beach, ready to wreak havoc on the advancing American forces. The Rangers, with their mission now clear, quickly and systematically destroyed the guns using their thermite grenades, melting their firing mechanisms and rendering them completely useless. They had achieved their primary objective. But their ordeal was far from over. The small force of Rangers, now numbering fewer than 200 men, were completely isolated, cut off from the main invasion force, and deep in enemy territory. The German forces in the area quickly regrouped and launched a series of ferocious and sustained counterattacks against the small American perimeter. For 2 long and desperate days, the Rangers at Point du Hoc held their ground, fighting off wave after wave of German attacks. Their supplies of ammunition and medical equipment began to run dangerously low, and their casualties mounted. They were completely surrounded, their situation growing more desperate with each passing hour. But they held on. Finally, on the morning of D-Day +2, reinforcements from the American forces who had landed at Omaha Beach finally managed to break through and to relieve the beleaguered Rangers. Of the more than 225 men who had begun the assault, only about 90 were still able to fight. The heroic stand of the Rangers at Point du Hoc remains one of the most incredible and inspiring stories of the entire Second World War, a powerful and lasting testament to the extraordinary courage and the unwavering determination of the common soldier in the face of impossible odds. By the end of that long and bloody day, June 6, 1944, the Allied forces had achieved their primary objective. They had successfully breached Hitler's formidable Atlantic Wall and had established a fragile, but vital, foothold on the shores of Normandy. The cost had been immense, particularly on the sands of Omaha Beach, but they were in France to stay. However, the success of the D-Day landings was just the very beginning of a long, arduous, and incredibly costly campaign. The 5 landing beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, were still just 5 isolated and vulnerable pockets, separated by stretches of German-held territory. The next crucial and incredibly difficult task for the Allied forces was to push inland, to link up these separate beachheads, and to form a single, solid, and defensible front from which they could begin the great liberation of France. As the Allied soldiers, weary and battle-hardened from their ordeal on the beaches, began to move inland into the Norman countryside, they entered a new and completely unexpected kind of battlefield, a landscape that would prove to be just as deadly and just as challenging as the beaches themselves. This was the infamous bocage, or the hedgerow country of Normandy. What was it? Can you picture it? For centuries upon centuries, the farmers of Normandy had divided their fields not with simple fences, but with thick, ancient earthen mounds, some of them over 10 feet high and several feet thick. And growing out of these mounds were dense, tangled hedges, shrubs, and trees, their roots intertwined deep within the earth. These hedgerows formed a dense and confusing checkerboard pattern across the entire landscape, turning the beautiful French countryside into a deadly and claustrophobic maze. For the advancing Allied soldiers, particularly the Americans who were pushing inland from Omaha and Utah beaches, this terrain was a tactical nightmare. Each small field, completely enclosed by its own impenetrable hedgerow, became its own separate, miniature fortress. The German defenders, who were absolute masters of defensive warfare, used this unique and ancient terrain to their absolute advantage. They would position their machine guns, their mortars, and their powerful anti-tank guns in the corners of these fields, creating a series of devastating, interlocking kill zones. The advancing Allied forces, particularly their powerful Sherman tanks, found it nearly impossible to break through these thick earthen walls. When a tank tried to drive over a hedgerow, it would expose its thin and vulnerable underbelly to the German anti-tank guns that were waiting on the other side. The infantry, in turn, were forced to engage in a brutal, field-by-field, hedgerow-by-hedgerow fight, a kind of combat for which they were almost completely unprepared. The fighting in the bocage was a slow, grinding, and incredibly costly affair. The long sight lines and the open fields that would have favored the Allies' superior air power and their powerful artillery were completely absent here. Instead, the combat was often at incredibly close quarters, sometimes just a few yards, with sudden, violent, and terrifying ambushes being a constant and nerve-wracking threat. An Allied unit could spend an entire day fighting and suffering heavy casualties just to advance a few hundred yards, just to take a single field. The psychological toll of this kind of warfare was immense. The soldiers lived in a state of constant and gnawing tension, never knowing what lay hidden on the other side of the next hedgerow. Every hedgerow could conceal a machine gun nest, a mortar pit, or a hidden German tank. But slowly, painstakingly, and at a great cost in human lives, the Allied forces began to adapt their tactics to this new and challenging environment. The American soldiers, in a remarkable display of battlefield ingenuity, developed a new and brilliant solution to the problem of the hedgerows. A young sergeant named Curtis Cullen came up with the idea of welding the great, sharp, steel obstacles that the Germans had placed on the beaches onto the front of their Sherman tanks. These great steel prongs, these tusks, acted like a giant plow, allowing the tanks to smash their way directly through the earthen mounds of the hedgerows, creating a breach for the infantry to follow. These new, modified Rhino tanks were a game-changer, and the innovation quickly spread throughout the American forces. Despite the incredible difficulty of the fighting, the Allied forces continued their relentless push inland. Their goal was to capture the key strategic objectives, such as the great port of Cherbourg in the west, which was vital for bringing in supplies, and the ancient city of Caen in the east. The battle for these objectives would be long and brutal, but they were absolutely essential for the buildup of Allied supplies and reinforcements. The push inland from the beaches of Normandy was one of the most difficult and costly campaigns of the entire Second World War. It was a battle that was fought not just by generals and their grand strategies, but by the ordinary soldiers, the infantrymen who had to face the terror of the hedgerows every single day. Their incredible resilience, their remarkable adaptability, and their unwavering determination in the face of these immense challenges would ultimately secure the Normandy beachhead and pave the way for the final liberation of Europe. While the Allied forces were desperately fighting to secure their fragile foothold on the shores of Normandy, another, quieter drama was unfolding within the German High Command, a drama of confusion, of indecision, and of a catastrophic miscalculation that would ultimately seal the fate of the entire campaign. The incredible success of the Allied deception plan, Operation Bodyguard, had so thoroughly convinced the Germans that the main invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais that they were completely unable to correctly interpret the events of D-Day as they were actually happening. This fatal misjudgment, which was held by Adolf Hitler himself, would prevent the Germans from launching a swift and decisive counterattack against the vulnerable Allied beachheads, giving the Allies the precious time they needed to consolidate their position and to begin the great liberation of France. On the morning of June 6, as the first reports of the massive Allied landings in Normandy began to trickle into the German headquarters, the initial reaction was not one of panic, but of a strange and almost arrogant sense of satisfaction. The report seemed to confirm what they had long been expecting: a large-scale diversionary attack designed to draw their powerful reserves away from the Pas-de-Calais, where they believed the real invasion was still yet to come. The German commanders were so completely convinced by the Allied deception, by the phantom army that was supposedly being assembled under General Patton in Kent, that they viewed the news from Normandy through a lens of deep and unshakable confirmation bias. In a great stroke of luck for the Allies, one of the most brilliant and respected German commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man who was in charge of defending the coast, was not at his post on that fateful day. He had been so convinced by the forecasts of bad weather that he had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, believing that no invasion could possibly take place. His absence during the critical, initial hours of the landing created a profound leadership vacuum, a period of indecision and confusion that greatly hampered the German response. But the most critical and ultimately most disastrous element of the German command structure was that Adolf Hitler himself retained personal and absolute control over the powerful panzer tank divisions, the only force that could have realistically driven the Allies back into the sea in those first crucial hours. And as the reports from Normandy grew more urgent, Hitler, who was asleep at his headquarters when the invasion began and who refused to be woken, remained utterly convinced that Normandy was a feint, a clever trick. He refused to release the powerful panzer reserves, choosing instead to keep them stationed near the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for the main assault that he was certain was still to come. This single, catastrophic decision, born from the success of the Allied deception, would prove to be the greatest German blunder of the entire campaign. And so, the German response to the Normandy landings was slow, piecemeal, and tragically ineffective. The local German forces who were defending the Normandy coast fought with great courage and determination, particularly at Omaha Beach, but they were without the powerful armored support they so desperately needed. The only major armored counterattack of the day, which was launched by the 21st Panzer Division against the British forces at Sword Beach, was ultimately repelled, and the rest of the panzer divisions remained held in reserve, waiting for an order from Hitler that would come far too late. By the time the German High Command finally began to realize the true scale and the true objective of the Normandy landings, several crucial days had passed. And by then, the Allies had managed to land hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, and they had successfully linked up their separate beachheads to form a single, solid, and defensible front. The critical window of opportunity for the Germans to push the invaders back into the sea had closed forever. Hitler's great blunder, his refusal to believe the evidence of his own eyes and his stubborn adherence to the false reality that the Allies had so brilliantly created for him, had cost him the battle for Normandy, and ultimately, it would cost him the war. The success of the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, represented a truly monumental achievement for the Allied forces and a decisive and irreversible turning point in the Second World War. By successfully breaching Hitler's formidable Atlantic Wall, the Allies had finally established a secure and vital foothold in Western Europe, opening up the long-awaited and desperately needed second front that would relieve the immense pressure on the Soviet Union in the East. This incredible victory, however, a triumph of immense courage, brilliant planning, and industrial might, came at an almost unimaginable price. And it was not an end in itself, but rather the dramatic and powerful opening act, the overture, to a long, arduous, and incredibly costly campaign to liberate the entire continent of Europe from the iron grip of Nazi tyranny. What was the true human cost of D-Day? It was staggering. In just a single 24-hour period, the Allied forces suffered an estimated 10,000 casualties, a number that is still difficult to fully comprehend. This included over 4,000 confirmed dead. The sands of Omaha Beach, in particular, had been soaked with the blood of a generation of young American soldiers. But the cost was not limited to the Allies. The German defenders, many of them young men themselves, also suffered immense losses in their desperate and often heroic attempts to repel the invasion. And countless innocent French civilians, who had been praying for this very day of liberation, were caught in the devastating crossfire of the initial naval and aerial bombardment and the subsequent, brutal fighting. The true price of this great victory was paid in human lives, a debt that can never be fully repaid. The logistical challenges that were overcome to make the invasion possible were also on a scale that had never been seen before in all of human history. The sheer amount of planning, of resources, and of intricate coordination that was required to land over 150,000 men on a hostile and heavily defended shore in a single day was a powerful testament to the incredible industrial and organizational might of the Allied nations. In the weeks and the long months that followed D-Day, the fighting in Normandy was brutal and relentless. The battle for the hedgerow country, the bocage, was a slow, grinding, and incredibly costly affair, with every single field and every small village being fiercely contested. The capture of the strategic port of Cherbourg in the west and the ancient city of Caen in the east, objectives that the Allied planners had hoped to capture on D-Day itself, took weeks of heavy and bloody fighting, resulting in thousands upon thousands more casualties. But slowly, painstakingly, and inexorably, the Allied forces, with their overwhelming superiority in men and in material, began to push the German army back. By late August of 1944, the Allies had finally and successfully broken out of the Normandy beachhead, and in a moment of incredible joy and celebration that echoed all around the world, the great city of Paris was finally liberated. The success of the D-Day landings had a profound and devastating psychological impact on the German High Command. The failure to repel the invasion, combined with the earlier and stunning success of the Allied deception plan, had completely shattered their aura of military invincibility. And with a powerful new front now opened in the West, Germany was now forced to fight a desperate and unwinnable two-front war, a war that it could not possibly hope to win. The road to final victory in Europe would still be long and difficult. Great and terrible battles, like the Battle of the Bulge, still lay ahead. But the path to that victory, the beginning of the end, had been opened on the beaches of Normandy. D-Day was the overture, the dramatic and powerful opening act to the final liberation of a continent. And what is the legacy of D-Day today? It endures as a powerful and poignant symbol of the incredible courage, the immense sacrifice, and the great international cooperation that was required to defeat tyranny and to restore freedom to the world. The serene and beautiful cemeteries that now dot the coastline of Normandy, with their endless, neat rows of white crosses and stars of David, are a silent and solemn testament to the immense price that was paid on that single, longest day. They stand as a quiet reminder of the incredible bravery of the young men who stormed those beaches, who jumped from those plains into the darkness, and who gave their lives for a cause that was greater than themselves. Their profound sacrifice would ensure that the great shadow that had fallen over the continent of Europe would finally be lifted, and that the light of freedom would once again shine. And with that final thought, our long and somber journey through the story of D-Day comes to its end. It is a story of immense strategic complexity, of incredible technological innovation, and, above all, of profound and unforgettable human courage and sacrifice. Now, let the echoes of that distant, thunderous battle finally fade into the quiet and stillness of the night. It is time for history to rest, and it is time for you to rest as well. Good night, and have peaceful dreams.